Ladies and gentlemen, in a moment, our Institute's Director, Ambassador Ed Derision, will formally welcome you. Sadly, I myself cannot be with you the entire evening tonight because many months ago, I made another commitment that will take me away. But first, let me say that you are in tonight for a very real treat. And before leaving, I want to recognize two important participants who also happen to be very close friends of Susan's and mine. First, Mac McLarty, who served this country with distinction as President Clinton's White House Chief of Staff, Counselor to the President, and Special Envoy for the Americas, and his wife Donna. They have generously endowed this lecture series, and we are tremendously grateful, Mac, for your support. Mac McLarty is an excellent example of the kind of bipartisanship that was practiced back there in the good old days when we were in government, and when I can say without fear of contradiction, when we got things done for the people. And he will introduce tonight's guest. And second, Bob Zoellick. Bob Zoellick is without a doubt one of the most able and accomplished American public servants of our generation, and for that matter, of all other generations. I really do owe a great deal of whatever I achieved as Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of State to Bob Zoellick. He later became President of the World Bank, Deputy Secretary of State, and U.S. Trade Representative. And he served in all three of those positions with great distinction as well. Bob is smart. He'll let you know he's smart. He's highly intelligent. We all know that. So much so that when he wrote speeches for me, I received always very high praise for those speeches, even though I didn't always know what I was actually saying. You will enjoy listening to Bob's insight and wisdom tonight. Thank you, Mac and Donna, for endowing this lecture series, and thank you, Bob, for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Secretary Baker. This year, the Baker Institute is celebrating its 25th anniversary with a series of commemorative events throughout the year, including this evening's program, and we're going to be hosting a gala in November. The logo of our commemorative year is a quarter century making history. We're commemorating not only the work we've achieved over the past quarter century, but also moving ahead with a new strategic framework for all our research programs that will take us through the next 5 years and beyond. So the Institute has become, in effect, a prominent national and international forum for addressing public policy issues. Our model has worked in no small part due to the support of many of you in the audience, and I want to again repeat what the Secretary said, Mac. We really appreciate your support throughout the years. So as Secretary Baker mentioned, tonight we are honored to host two longtime friends of the Institute for a discussion on one of the most timely topics facing our country, Nafta and international trade, subjects with which both guests are intimately familiar. So without further ado, I'll just add a few more biographic footnotes to what the Secretary mentioned about Mac. Mac is chairman of McLarty Associates, which he co-founded in 1998 following a distinguished career in the private sector and in public service, advising Presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. Mac served as Bill Clinton's White House Chief of Staff and later counselor to the President. During his time as Chief of Staff, Nafta was enacted, among other important pieces of legislation. In 1994, Mac also organized the Summit of the Americas in Miami, and in 1996, he was appointed Special Envoy for the Americas, a position, Mac, I think we certainly sorely need today. In recognition of his work, Mac was awarded the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Medal and the highest civilian honors of 7 Latin American countries. So we're delighted to have you both with us tonight for what is certain to be a valuable discussion of NAFTA and U.S. trade in the Western Hemisphere. I now have the honor of turning the podium over to our good friend Mac McLarty.
Ambassador Ridgen, thank you very much for your very kind words, but more importantly, Ed, for your decades of distinguished public servants, if I've got it right, under 8 presidents. Quite a record. And thank you for your leadership here at the Baker Institute. On behalf of our entire family, Don and I thank you for your partnership and friendship in helping to establish this lecture series with Secretary Baker. Simply put, the Baker Institute is truly one of the finest public policy institutes, not only in our country, but the world. There's so much to be proud of here, and the legacy will live on and on for many, many years to come. And that's no surprise, given its namesake. Mr. Secretary, it's a joy and a privilege to be with you, and I'm delighted that Susan is with you. It brings back warm and good memories of indeed an era gone by that, by George, we did get a lot done together, including the passage of the Nafta, where the Secretary, along with other former Secretaries of State, spoke persuasively, eloquently, and powerfully to achieve a bipartisan vote that I think indeed moved all 3 countries in the right direction for many years, and we'll talk about that more with our distinguished speaker. As all of you know, Jim Baker has been described as the man who made Washington work. And he exemplified that throughout his distinguished career as a negotiator, a deal maker, and a forward thinker who got things done and got them done in the right way. He is truly a singular statesman, and he and Susan have been forces and forces for good. From a personal standpoint, as I look out over this audience, I am reminded it's a great pleasure to be back in the great city of Houston. I had the opportunity to work here and to spend a great deal of time here during my time in the natural gas days with Arkla Gas and with Intex. And I really saw firsthand during that period in the late 80s, early 90s, Houston's transformation and continued development into a world-class city, a more diversified economy, a more outward-looking approach, while preserving its rich heritage and enhancing and establishing its status as the energy capital of the world. So I am honored to be here and honored to introduce our speaker. Secretary Baker has already outdone me, so to speak, given the long history that he and Bob Zoellick have together. I would only echo that, from a bipartisan standpoint, that Bob is indeed one of the smartest, most capable public servants that I have certainly ever had the privilege to work with, and indeed that our country has had in its memory, and that is not an overstatement. Jim, I first got to know Bob during the transition between President Bush 41 and the Clinton administrations. He was serving as your deputy secretary there, deputy chief of staff, after 10 years at Treasury and State. So I feel like, Bob, this is full circle with your coming back to the Baker Institute. Bob was the first person that I met at the White House gates in late 1992. We were meeting for a working breakfast in the White House mess, and our cars pulled up at those gates exactly at the same time, and we walked in together. And looking back, that's a metaphor about how democracy should work. I've been grateful to this day for Bob's honest advice and keen insight. Secretary Baker has already outlined Bob's distinguished career in public service as well as the private sector. He is currently a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University and has a portfolio of activities. He received the Aztec Eagle Award by the Mexican government, which is the highest civilian award and particularly appropriate tonight. He has seen how things work in the public sector, the private sector, and in multinational organizations. That's very unique. In these uncertain times and these uncharted waters, I can think of no one else that we would rather hear from tonight, particularly regarding U.S. Mexican relations, but the global perspective more broadly. So it's a great honor to bring forward the distinguished Ambassador and Secretary, Robert Zoellick.
It's a particular pleasure to be here with all of you tonight to share a perspective on North America and to see how well the Baker Institute has done since I last had an opportunity to visit here. It's a wonderful gem for the Houston community, so I thank all of you for your interest and support in it. I want to thank my friend Ed and also his colleagues that really did so much work to make all this happen tonight, Robert and Lisa and Laura. And I have the privilege of recognizing two of America's finest public servants. Both have been very committed to the idea of North America. I owe a special thanks to Secretary Baker, who opened tremendous opportunities to me, taught me a great deal, and enabled me to contribute to our country's story, which is the highest honor and privilege. I also want to thank Susan, who is the kindest and most thoughtful person I've ever had the opportunity to meet. As the years pass, I reflect not only on Secretary Baker's skills and his accomplishments, but even more on his integrity and his sense of how the U.S. should act in the world. Now, there's been a little bit in the news recently about changes in Washington, and it recalled for me some of the discussions that some of us working with Secretary Baker had during some tumultuous moments that we were perhaps kind of getting a little bit out on a limb on some issue that might cause us some trouble. And I'll always remember Secretary Baker's words to people who were pushing at the edge. He said, "You know, Bob, or Margaret, or Bob Kimmett," he said, "you know, I want you to know I'll be with you as absolutely long as I can." In that moment, you knew you better do things properly. I also want to thank Mac McLarty, who's the truest of friends, who worked very closely with President Clinton to pass Nafta and has devoted decades to building ties of friendship with Mexico and Latin America. He's a gracious gentleman, and it's wonderful that he's made this generous gift for the lecture series to the Baker Institute. Now, I have to be frank with you. These are some trying days for people committed to a positive vision for North America. So I thought this evening I'd step back a bit to offer some perspective from the vantage point of the past, but also a little bit about what might be. For reasons of history, as people in this part of the country know well, and for political culture, Mexico, Canada, and the United States are all highly protective of their national sovereignty and independence. After all, our three nations were born in conflict with one another. Some of you may recall some people who called themselves Texans declared independence from Mexico and then waged a bitter fight for their cause. Within a decade, the United States fought a war with Mexico, and Mexico recalls losing about 1/3 of its territory. Then there was the French invasion of Mexico to install Maximilian of Austria as emperor in the 1860s, and that certainly heightened sensitivities to the notion of independence and sovereignty. Woodrow Wilson sent U.S. forces across the border before the U.S. entered World War I. And then the Mexican Revolution and reaction against foreign influence under Porfirio Diaz led to the creation of the PRI and the corporate estate. Now, FDR's good neighbor policy sought to overcome some of these tensions. And the Alliance for Progress in 1961 recognized the importance of growth and development in the Western Hemisphere. But the U.S. and Mexico remained, as the author of one book titled it, distant neighbors. So the historical legacy to the north was also somewhat fractious. English-speaking Canada really came into being after the Loyalists fled our revolution, and we fought again in the War of 1812. As the U.S. grew, Washington threatened to hold Canada as hostage during disagreements with London. Few people in the United States know that Canada's legal creation was done through the British North America Act of 1867, and that allowed the four eastern provinces of Canada to come together because London was a little worried about the defenses of Canada after the United States had preserved the Union and had a very large army and was a little frustrated with some of the British policies. So even the creation of Canada stemmed from some of these frictions. Secretary of State Seward, one of Secretary Baker's predecessors, wanted to buy British Columbia after he bought Alaska. And the locals, it turns out, were quite sympathetic to the idea. But the Canadian Confederation got ahead of the deal. This wouldn't have happened if Baker were secretary, and offered a transcontinental railway and solving some of British Columbia's debts. So we lost out on what would have been fine Pacific coastline. But of course, Canada and the United States grew much closer as allies in World War I and World War II. And again, at this point, Treasury Secretary Baker played a very key role in integrating Canada and the U.S. economically by stepping in to save the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement negotiations in 1987 and 88. Also, during that same period, Secretary Baker was working closely with Mexico during the debt crises of the 1980s. And that cooperation and the recognition of President de la Madrid and then later President Salinas that Mexico had to make a change, had to make structural reforms, particularly with the end of a Cold War, led to a very bold venture. So some 25 years ago, the three countries of North America decided to launch a novel project about deeper integration while respecting the sovereignty of the three countries. And in doing so, they also bridged the north-south divide between developed and developing countries. And Nafta was the cornerstone of that project. Now, unlike the European Union, North America was not to be an experiment in shared sovereignty, nor a protected bloc. NAFTA was conceived as an integrated economy within a global system. All three would maintain their independence, yet all three would compete together as a continental economy in a world system. And that's very important for today. It's much more than a regional issue. It's a question of how America faces the world. Now, much has been accomplished in North America over 25 years. And the Baker Institute and others have done excellent work charting the increases in trade and investment and jobs and income. With the combination of innovation and information technology, NAFTA enabled the U.S. to boost productivity and global competitiveness through the creation of supply chains that had extraordinary influence. It's not unusual for the assemblies of North American autos to cross the border some 13 times on their way to completion. Mexico's exports to the United States contain about 40% U.S. content, while Canada's exports to the United States contain about 25% U.S. content. And in contrast, that figure for China is 4%. But I also want to draw attention to the gains beyond trade. When Secretary Baker was at the Treasury, Mexico used to have a macroeconomic crisis shortly after each presidential campaign, and the reason was clear. People spent a lot of money, they couldn't afford it, and then the crash came. Today, if you look at the macroeconomics of the three countries, they've largely converged in terms of inflation, exchange rate volatility, short-term interest rates, industrial production, although some of the challenges that the U.S. has posed to NAFTA have placed strains on Mexico over the past year or so. Also, impressive colleagues for the United States from both Mexico and Canada. Mexico had one of the top central bankers in the world, and Augustine Carstens, recently appointed to be head of the BIS, the Club of Central Bankers in Switzerland. And the Bank of England hired Mark Carney away from Canada. In energy, Merrill's Matthews of the Institute of Policy Innovation in Dallas pointed out that North America now leads the world in production of energy. In 2016, the three countries produced 22 million barrels a day. In 2015, North America produced 33.8 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And each of the three depend on one another to exchange the crude oil for different refineries, for technology and investment, for pipelines. And as part of this, for example, U.S. natural gas is lowering electricity costs and carbon for Mexico, increasing the overall competitiveness of North America. Then there's security cooperation. Admiral Stavridis, former commander of NATO, now dean of the Fletcher School, wrote a piece recently in the Wall Street Journal explaining how important cooperation with Mexico was on extradition, intelligence to fight drug cartels and organized crime, even use of drones, scanning of cargo, illegal finance, dealing with illegal immigrants from Central America. John Kelly, at that time Secretary of Homeland Security, now the White House Chief of Staff, said last year, quote, "Border security for the United States starts 1,500 miles to the south, at Mexico's southern border." And in 2015, Mexico apprehended some 150,000 Central Americans traveling north. I even saw a huge shift in the world of foreign policy. When I started working with Mexico under Secretary Baker in the 1980s, and I wasn't quite sure of Mexico's foreign policy position, I could take the U.S. position and put a minus sign in front of it. And the reason was that the old PRI system had brought in the leftist intellectuals and put them in the foreign ministry where they could indulge in anti-Americanism and not deal with fundamental problems with what the regime wanted to do. But by the time I became the U.S. Trade Representative in 2001, my closest colleagues in international trade were my Mexican and Canadian partners. And when I moved to the World Bank, dealing with international economic issues, including the financial crisis, and the discussions at the G20, frankly, the Mexicans and Canadians were the top of the line. And sometimes, I'd have to say, on some of their policies, I was a little bit more sympathetic than some that I saw from the Obama administration. Canada and Mexico are extremely strong partners of the United States, and this brought home to me working on an environmental issue. I was talking with Chancellor Merkel of Germany, and she was talking about the importance of getting a developing country aligned on the issue at the time. And I said, well, Mexico is supportive. And she said, well, Mexico, of course, Mexico is going to support the United States. And I thought how different that was than 10 or 20 years before, that Europeans would assume that we were aligned. President Peña Nieto's administration has taken bold structural economic reforms in energy, telecom, education, and tax. So in addition to the macroeconomic work, they focused on the future possibilities for growth. Nevertheless, North America still has great potential that we haven't tapped. North America could become a new type of growth market, combining the best of developed country innovation and the best of developing economy structural reforms. North American demographics are far better than those of Europe or China or Japan. Costs are rising elsewhere, including in China. So we should be viewing North America as the continental base for a U.S. global strategy. Consider four legs of that base. First, in energy, there's still much to do, as people in this town know better than anywhere else. Strengthening the continental energy infrastructure, pipelines, grids, standards, in trying to support Mexico's historic reforms with investment and the production potential, which frankly could still be at risk depending on the outlook of the upcoming election. Promoting safety, conservation, lower carbon emissions. Second, for economic competitiveness, what we should be aiming at is to try to achieve free and impeded movement of goods and services across all three borders, by expanding the infrastructure and the transportation network, adding pre-clearance programs, using technology more effectively. There's an experiment now in Vancouver with the United States about using biometrics, artificial intelligence, facial recognition. We could cut costs and move things across so much more effectively. Also trying to achieve a goal of cleared once, approved thrice. Third, for security, we still face some very serious common threats. The criminal organizations. Terrorism. Hezbollah, which is now linked with organized criminal and narcotics networks for financing. Disease, environmental topics, illegal immigration, which of course then gets connected again with the smugglers for narcotics. Cyber issues. We should be working over the long term for a goal of having a unified security strategy. And U.S. and Canada have an interest in assisting Mexico to strengthen the democratic rule of law. That criminal networks that still plague Mexico need to be addressed. You need to try to develop resilient and cohesive communities, not just reforms at the Mexico City level, but all through the different states. We have to stop the arms and the drug smuggling. And then on top of that, the U.S., Mexico, Canada, Colombia have an interest in assisting those very weak states of Central America along the lines of Plan Colombia. It's one of the issues that Secretary Baker first dealt with when he was elected secretary before turning to the issues of the Cold War, was trying to end the endless conflicts of fight. When I was USTR, I tried to create the Central American Free Trade Agreement to create an economic basis of that. But we're now in a stage where those states are at risk of those governments being taken over by very dangerous forces. Traditionally, the United States has ignored Central America until the fires burn, then we go in, we get our fingers burnt. This is an area where we should be working together with Mexico and Colombia as well. Fourth, we need to build a strong North American community. People are our most vital resource. An educated, skilled, flexible, and mobile workforce could tap our demographic asset. That's why it's so frustrating to see the immigration issue just treated certainly as a negative. If you look around the world, what will drive the future? It's people. We need to have the systems that are on the cusp of some transformational reforms with different digital methods and others. With secure borders, we could have visas based on economic needs and skills. And taking the full picture into account, North Americans have been developing a shared culture. Now, that's not a common culture because we're all proud of our distinctive identities. Yet, if you view it from a global perspective, and I spend most of my time traveling in Europe and Asia and other parts, the perspective that we have, our similarities, our interests, our outlooks, are unique in pulling us together. Now, sad to say, President Trump has chosen a different path, emphasizing a wall, hostility to immigration, and antipathy towards Nafta. And frankly, I don't think he's going to change. He's triggered resentments and frustrations in Mexico during an election year, and all of you know the risks that we have and face if Mexico turns back. Our republic recognizes the role of a legitimate opposition in pushing back. So we need to speak out. There's a battle of ideas going on here. I'm encouraged that the polls show that only 14% of Americans want to withdraw from NAFTA. And despite the Trump administration's position on NAFTA, support has actually increased in the United States to 57%. And it could be much higher. One of my complaints about the Obama administration was the president banned the use of the term NAFTA because it was politically unpopular. I learned a few things from Secretary Baker, and one is it's kind of hard to win an argument if only one side argues the point. It's easy for that side, I guess. So now the good news, from my perspective at least, is that for the first time people are seeing the importance of trade. You get farmers and agriculture groups getting quite anxious because their exports have increased about 350% under NAFTA. You could see the energy companies. I've been talking with some railroads that talk about the concern for their ability to move goods around and all the different supply chains. So I hear a lot more attention to members of Congress asking them to send the president the message that they want to keep NAFTA. So I hope the Texas delegation speaks up too. I went to Mexico last year and I was encouraged that even after the insults and the threats, the past 25 years have created a resiliency in the North American idea among Mexicans. And for those of you that work with Mexico, it's a very frustrating experience because, frankly, starting with that time with Secretary Baker at Treasury and State, I've watched this transformation where Mexicans are drawn to respect the United States. They want to be treated as partners. And when a friend turns against you that way, it's particularly hard. It's almost worse than with a foe. And frankly, people in Mexico are a little uncertain about where this leads. They don't want to give up on North America or the United States, nor should they do so. So I often speak internationally with people, ask me what's going on, and I try to say, look, keep in mind, the U.S. has a president. We don't have a core leader like China. So the United States is also the Congress, it's the governors, it's the states, it's the cities, it's the private sector that has totally revolutionized energy around the world or changed things in software or different types of social media. So here's the vision that I think is worth fighting for. 500 million North Americans, 3 democracies, energy self-sufficiency and even exports, integrated in manufacturing, agriculture, and service industries, human capital development and a shared workforce, common security aims, and cooperation globally. That vision puts 1.3 billion Chinese in a slightly different perspective. Now, our 3 countries have gone a long way over 2 centuries. And with the drive of presidents from Texas, Secretary of State from Texas, yes, some fellows from Arkansas, Eastern Texas, we made some great progress over 25 years. So thanks for inviting me here tonight to send a message. Don't stop. Keep looking ahead. And I know the work at the Baker Institute and the people in the community of Houston will help. So thank you.
Ambassador Zoellick, you made your case in a serious, substantive, thoughtful manner, as those of us who know you were confident that you would do. You also made it in a persuasive manner. And I hope and believe if people like you and Secretary Baker, who just departed, keep kind of putting forward the right message, and some of us from the other side of the aisle, but we'll find that common ground can be supportive in that. It'll make a real difference at the end of the day. So I think the format here is to open it up for questions. We have microphones on each side of the center section here. If you have a question, please come to the mic. Bob and I got to spend some time with Tony Payan, who does such an outstanding job leading the Mexico Institute here with the students earlier in the day, and of course it always is stimulating, and we had to be pretty much on our game, I think, to make sure we interface correctly with it. Yes, sir. First question.
What Mac and I mentioned is, I talked about North America, but there's a lot of other things going on in the world. And so, please feel free to ask whatever you want.
Yep.
Since Secretary Baker and Mrs. Baker left, you can even ask me to tell Baker stories. Those are always good. But please, over to you.
Thank you very much for being here and for your thoughtful talk. If you'll beg my forgiveness in shifting on the first question to China and asking a sort of macro question, do you think they're playing fair, however you would define that, on international trade? And if yes or no, how would you sort of approach a fairer trade with China if you were in the current administration?
So the short answer is mixed. Not to totally equate the two, but you might ask the same about the United States these days. And Mac and I were exchanging notes about this. I'm going to take a little longer to address your question because I think it's a very big and important one.
It is.
Because the mood, certainly in Washington policymaking, I think around the country, is you can turn into increased acrimony towards China. And just as in my first answer, the problem is that there's pieces on both sides, but you have to be realistic about it. So on one hand, look, to share a story, when President Xi took over 5 years ago, he created a film about the end of the Soviet Union. Well, if you had that film at the Baker Institute or in Germany, it would be how Gorbachev helped end the Cold War. Chinese version is a little different. Gorbachev is the guy that abandoned the Communist Party, broke up his country, led to ruin. Not so subtle message, it's not going to happen here. And what we've seen over the past 5 years is a consolidation of power under Xi Jinping. By the way, I think part of this is also there's some threats to him as he tries to sort of move forward the agenda. And there's no doubt that in terms of space and society, that you can see it with people we talk to in universities and others, they're feeling the constraints. So that part of China is worrisome, and you need to be practical. Xi Jinping's #1 aim is the preservation of the Communist Party. You can never forget that, whatever the economic topic is. On the other hand, what you see now in the United States is this view that working with China has failed, didn't produce anything. And I was just going back with a friend of mine, and actually one of these issues started with Secretary Baker in a visit we did, the first official visit to China after Tiananmen in '91. And at that time, China was one of the worst missile proliferators. China joined the missile technology control regime, became quite significant in blocking that. Same with nuclear, same with chemical and biological weapons. In the financial crisis, Hank Paulson tells a story from his book about how the Russians approached the Chinese and said, hey, let's dump all the dollars. And the Chinese said, we don't think that's a very good idea. When I was at the World Bank, the Chinese were excellent partners. They supported things I wanted to do. I could get them to produce sort of additional resources. There's been concern about this Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. I spent 30 years, much of it in U.S. public service, people wanting me to do things and have the U.S. pay for it. Not so much a problem if you need infrastructure to have the Chinese put up some money, as long as you deal with the corruption, you have transparency, the procurement rules. And the new head of the bank actually hired a bunch of people from the World Bank to try to sort of do the proper things. I do a lot in the conservation space, and I was with a group recently, Wildlife Conservation Society, very pleased because China has the elephant ivory ban, and which is very significant for saving that part of the wildlife. I did something similar with them on tigers. So the message is, and I could go on and on across different areas, the idea that cooperation and pushing China didn't work just isn't right, okay? And #1 example, ask if President Trump thinks he wants to get some help from China and North Korea. So that's one element. Now, on the other hand, on the economics, for example, this is very important. People say, oh, Chinese are violating the rules. I'm a lawyer as well as somebody who deals with economics and finance, so I say, what rules? Frankly, if there's problems with the WTO, we bring cases. We've won a lot of them. They changed along the way. Now, the problem is there are a lot of areas where we think we'd like rules, but there's no international rules, okay? Now, how do you deal with that? Well, to deal with that by actually negotiating new rules. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which took new advanced areas in terms of e-commerce, intellectual property, data, others, environment, labor issues. But we've withdrawn out of that. And that would have been a point of leverage, because frankly, if that would have gone forward, Korea would have joined, probably some in Southeast Asia would have joined. And remember, China's not monolithic. There are reformers in China that want to work on some of these sort of areas together. So at the same time, in areas of security, for example, you have to decide where are you going to draw the line, and where are you willing to, if you're willing to put the lives of your men and women on the line to do that. With areas of the South China Sea, our real interest is in the freedom of navigation, and we should be forceful without being belligerent about those types of lines. The intellectual property rights have clearly been stolen, violated. It's interesting. I wasn't in government over the past years, but I asked some people in the intelligence agencies. President Obama worked out an arrangement with China to try to avoid stealing some of the commercial espionage, the cyber. And at least the message I got was it seemed to be working. Now let me go back to a little bit of this idea of how do you explain things to the Chinese. Remember, what the U.S. had to do, and I actually had some sideline conversations with the Chinese, is to say, look, we understand there's espionage in the world. We understand that you're going to try to steal things, from the military, or frankly, my security background information, which they took from the personnel records, along with many other people. Said, we understand, and we'll do the same thing if we get a chance. But commercial, we don't steal. So, you know, for the Chinese, this is where you kind of have to work with people. They need to say, okay, it's all right, and you don't like it, but you could take the F-35, but we can't take, you know, technology from a company. Yeah, that's right. That's how we do things, okay? Now, that's partly because the U.S. is a private sector system. Even if we took this stuff, we couldn't, who do you give it to, right? And because you've got a competitive market out there. But once that was explained to China, at least what I was told by those people, they've sort of geared it back. Now, that's different. That's the cyber commercial aspect than sort of other sort of IPR violations. In the IPR area, I think you need to figure out a way to make them pay a price, okay? I wouldn't use broad-based tariffs, look like we're probably gonna do. There's different ways that we could block people or block different types of institutions. But my major point is this. We're headed to a relation now with China where the assumption is everything failed to interconnect with China, and these guys are taking our lunch, and we have to bash them, okay? I'll share with you another little anecdote on this. So about 2 to 3 weeks ago, the top foreign policy person is called State Counselor Yang Jiechi, was in Washington. Yep. So he was there for a couple days and is seeing the Trump administration. He had a dinner with a few of us. And so he said to me on the side of the dinner, he said, look, we understand China and the U.S. are competing. We can live with that. He said, but when we read the national security strategy, which Americans don't read, but the Chinese do, he says basically China is a fundamental threat to the United States. He said, so should we, when you come to us and you ask to work with us on North Korea or Afghanistan or Pakistan, and you think we're a fundamental threat that, you know, has to be dealt with, how do we think about that? I don't know, what answer do you give? You know, what answer does the Trump administration give? So we've dealt with these in the past in foreign policy. My key point is I'm not trying to whitewash China. There's a lot of things that one doesn't like, okay? There's a number of things you need to push them on. But boy, I think it's a mistake to detach and just try to clobber them on stuff without trying to push them and find some middle ground. I'll give you, actually, if I were on the trade side now, let me tell you what I'd be working on. The Chinese have been very forthright about identifying about 10 areas for innovation and technology. And it's in the China Manufacturing 2025 report. It's in their 5-year plans. And some of the tools that they've identified, like stronger IPR rights would be good, and various research and publications could be fine. There's some that'll be very bad and be sort of indigenous innovation and cut things off. We should be working with the Europeans, and to a degree the Japanese and others, to press the Chinese to say, look, if you develop it this way, there's a chance we can cooperate and all benefit. And by the way, in areas like life sciences, because we've had decades of Chinese students coming to our graduate schools, there's private sector networks that, you know, are quite constructive for both sides here. Or if you go in a way of trying to cut yourself off, you'll cut yourself off from the rest of the world economy, you'll lose, but also you'll pay a price in it. We're not doing that now because, frankly, the administration's aim really isn't to open those markets. It's to close our markets, and we want to use an excuse to do so. And the proof I'll give you of that is when the president was there in November, the Chinese had some steps to open up asset management. Sophia, I chair a company now, and they tried to say to the administration, look, this is something that we can do together. And the administration said, no, we don't want to do those types of negotiations where we open markets. And, you know, the most recent part was Trump said, you're supposed to eliminate $100 billion off your deficit. How do you do that? I mean, you know, and this is the same problem with the Mexican bilateral trade deficit, by the way. So I mention this because, boy, I can see this is going to be very difficult to even say anything that shows any empathy or sense of the Chinese side. You run a risk these days. But I worry. It's a big country, you know. What, you know, and you know, there's been benefits. There's been a report. Tom Friedman wrote a piece that talked about a study done by some guys at MIT that talked about the job loss in China. That was real. Yeah. By the way, I think it was more done by currency exchange rates, and that is an area where Hank Paulson got him to change. But you want to know what you don't see is there's another study that was done that talked about the jobs that were created by selling stuff to China, and it's roughly equivalent. Again, you only see sort of one side of the puzzle. So, you know, this is going to be an issue where, just as Baker was, you got to be firm and tough and have people not want to mess around with you, but you got to try to find the cooperative areas. You know, we unified Germany with the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. If we had just stood off to the side, it wouldn't have worked to the same way. Or if we just beat them over the head, it wouldn't work to the same way. So that's reason I took some time on this question is that it's going to be a hot one, and it's going to be tough.
It's a great first question. I think we've all heard of double headers. Tonight, I think we've gotten really just depthful, serious view with a lot of constructive, specific suggestions on the North American continent, the U.S. Mexico relationship with Mexico and Canada. And I'm delighted that the first question was about China, because we talked about it earlier. It obviously is a key and front and center issue. So I think a full, depthful, serious answer, and particularly one that responded specifically to some of the current discussion and current direction, is just exactly what needed to be said at Rice University and the Baker Institute. Yes, sir, you're next, and we'll go to you next.
Thank you, Honorable Zoellick, for your wonderful words. Very interesting and very informative. I'm just wondering, U.S. is the big brother in Nafta, so how can they influence the refugees and the people that are leaving Central America and coming through Mexico and the U.S.? You mentioned that several 100,000 people came here. So what can we do to make an environment where those people don't have to leave their own countries and live their happy, great life instead of coming here? That's my question, sir.
Great question.
Well, as your question suggests, it's got to start in Central America. So I made a little allusion to this about the efforts that Secretary Baker made to kind of end some of the warfare and conflict, and some of the things I tried to do on the economic side. When I went to the World Bank, I was also trying to integrate the three economies more effectively to draw investment. And there's no way around that. I mean, at the end of the day, I think, whether it's help with intelligence, with organized crime networks, MS-13 and these gang groups, you need to try to support those very fragile democracies, or one that's kind of sort of on the edge. And again, just to give a little historical perspective on this, when I negotiated the Central American Free Trade Agreement, which was with 5 countries plus the Dominican Republic, we found that the barrier, even though they had an economic union, the barriers between the countries were higher than with the United States. So we were partly trying to create a larger sort of integrated sort of market. And to give you a little sense of how what seemed like trade technicalities can make a difference, this is for one of the better off countries, Costa Rica. Costa Rica had a history of having sort of a parastatal control, the telecommunications area, and insurance. And we didn't really care about it so much for U.S. exports or something. We wanted to try to help Costa Rica reform. And it's a very sensitive political issue. And they just made the first steps, but then they went forward on their own. And I was so pleased to see that when one of my friends took over part of IBM's business, they set up a call center in Costa Rica, which they never would have been able to do with the old telecom system. So, telecom, as we saw in Mexico, is an intermediary system to sort of move forward. So it shows how the trade can fit the development. But then obviously, I think this is where we're in perilous straits in our relations with Mexico, because the U.S. can do a certain amount. But isn't it better if you could get Mexico to help you, and Panama to help you, or Colombia, which has gone through some of this experience? If there are Latin Americans that have gone through different experiences, that we could offer different types of support. In my experience, and this is one of the challenges for the U.S. today, the U.S. is most effective when we're the catalyst for bringing others together. Sometimes we're the only country can do that. So I was with Secretary Baker in the first Gulf War. He put together not only a military coalition, but a financial coalition that paid for the war. Now, this was because of trust. It was because of respect. It was because Baker's the sort of person that you want as your friend, and you certainly don't want as your enemy. And that sort of aspect. But at the end of the day, it was because the United States had to stand for something bigger, and we had to be the catalytic force. So that's the type of thing that we need to do with our own relations, but also with relations in the region. And by the way, be thinking about Venezuela, right? I live in Virginia. You guys are down here to the south a little bit. This Venezuela, this is going to go pop at some point. It's already popping, right?
Two excellent questions, and I think on Central America, It's kind of the pay me now or pay me later, which we're all familiar with. And either we invest and become engaged, or history has shown we then have problems and we spend enormous amounts of time, energy, effort, and money. Next question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Erika de la Garza. I direct the Latin America initiative here at the Baker Institute, and I want to thank you both for being back. My question is regarding the recent tariffs on aluminum and steel that the president announced. Given that he is invoking the use of a law that allows to protect industry under a national security pretext, is there anything the WTO can do?
We'll see, but let me draw the reason that this is particularly troublesome is not just the tariffs are 10 or 25%, but as you mentioned, it's using a part of U.S. domestic law called a 232, and it's for the president using authority for national security reasons.
This is the USTR person coming back out about that. Like, go right ahead.
But the connection is this. It first raises the question, because this goes back to the China question, sort of who are we trying to hit here, right? So are we really, since Canada is the biggest exporter of steel, are we really worried about Canada walking away in the midst of a conflict? I mean, maybe in the 1820s or 30s, but it's not really likely now, right? Or Mexico or South Korea or others. And so the president has further muddied it up by saying, okay, we're going to temporarily exempt Mexico and Canada as part of the Nafta negotiations. As I explained to one of the student groups, that's basically like saying, look, I've come in and I've shot your neighbors. I'm pointing the gun at you. I'm not going to fire now, but I want you to do this, this, and this, okay? So does that create a constructive negotiation? I mean, now, to bring into your point, the reason why it's particularly dangerous is there is a provision under the GATT treaty. I was going to say, I'm trying to remember, it's 12 or 13, but he'll mock me for knowing the article, that deals with national security. It's rarely invoked. And the reason it's rarely invoked is because it's a loophole that could blow away the rules. If you think about it, the U.S. is a big agricultural exporter. What about countries saying they need food security, okay? This part of the region wants to be an energy exporter. Well, what about energy security, okay? What about software? I mean, everything can fit into this sort of category, and that's why countries have been disciplined in doing it. And when the leader country, going back, decides to violate the rules, that's a big question. Now, WTO. The WTO, if people bring this action to the WTO, it's a no-win. Because what happens is, if the WTO says, look, this really isn't national security, it was protectionist grounds, then President Trump says, people in Geneva are telling the President of the United States how to guide America's national security, let's get out of the WTO. If the WTO says it's up to the countries to decide, well then Katie bar the door, it's off and running. And it's an interesting point, because if you watch this stuff closely, you'll see that the Europeans treated this in a different way. They treated it as a safeguard, which is something under U.S. law called 201. And under the safeguard, countries can temporarily raise barriers for a limited period of time if there's a surge of imports. And that allows them to retaliate to a sort of equal amount. And so the Europeans are trying to redefine it into a different way, allowing action. But what all these things do, and it's a good question because it shows how the threads get interconnected, and you pull on one and you can rip the whole fabric apart, is that it basically starts to lead people to say, well, let's work around the WTO rules. And here's a part most people haven't even heard of, but to give you the risk. All this goes back to WTO panels of 3 people, and then they go to an appellate system. There are 7 people that are appointed by all the countries to be on that appellate system, and they serve in panels of 3 on top of the first panel. So this actually started under the Obama administration, so they bear some of the fault, but the Trump administration has blocked people being appointed or reappointed. So we're now down to 4, and one of them comes off at the end of the year. So you get to a point where you may not have an appellate system. So they're not, this is very tricky but significant. It's a way that we don't withdraw from the WTO, but we choke it to death, okay? Now, if you're the United States and you've wanted a rules-based system and you think that we can compete if rules are fair, you know, this is not a wise course of action. It's moving us back to a world where, you know, it'll become sort of powers maneuvering against one another. If you're smaller countries, watch out. But even for the United States, you know, what the era that Baker represented, you know, with the end of the Cold War, was how the United States saw there was a systemic benefit from not just a narrow definition of national interest, but a national and international interest that served the United States pretty darn well.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Dave Hansen, chairman of the MIT Enterprise Forum here in Houston. The public perception of free trade has really gotten a bad name. It's to the point where I think it's really affecting the conversation about free trade. Politicians can't support free trade. You look at Hillary Clinton, she had to change her position on free trade. So it's almost, you can't have a rational discussion any longer. And it's almost reached the point where there's also a lot of misinformation out there about free trade. Now, it used to be you didn't have to defend free trade. It was just everybody felt good about it. You didn't have to, you know, beat the drum how good it was. But it seems like today it's becoming more and more important to make that case. But I don't see how it can happen if politicians can't really talk about it and it's really affecting them.
Well, it's a great question, and let me give you some interesting background. The Chicago Council on Global Relations did a survey. They've done these over the past 2 or 3 years. Now, don't hold me precisely to these numbers, but about 78% of Americans think trade and free trade is good for consumers. About 72% think it's good for the economy. Even 57% think it's good for jobs. Even before the election, there were polls about the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the one with Transatlantic, the TTIP. The support was in the low 60s and the opposition was in the high 30s, okay? So part of this is, of course, the intensity of feeling of people. And so a lot of people like trade, and frankly, I think some of the trade numbers have been going up because younger people who are more globalized frankly don't like Trump, right? And so they associate, therefore, what he's against. But that's an important starting point to kind of how people can understand the nature of the conversation. Then the second point is, you know, we have to do a better job of making the case. So I used the point about, you know, when President Obama refused to defend Nafta, that wasn't such a good way to sort of make the argument. But it also has to go beyond. So I've talked with business CEOs and others. You have to explain, you know, to your workforce how your jobs depend on trade, you know, the nature of the revenues that come in. Look, when I was trade representative, you know, Boeing, which probably sells 90% of its product abroad, the union was against trade. You know, you figure that out, okay? Or this was very revealing. In Silicon Valley, I could never get the votes of the 2 congresswomen from Silicon Valley when you think tech firms should be globalized. And Mike Froman, who was USTR under President Obama, said, I couldn't either, okay? Now, that's because they had other priorities. Guess what? Given the blockages they're starting to get in Europe on data and privacy and others, they're starting to sort of rethink this issue. And one of the, you know, encouraging things in a bizarre way is a little bit of what I was saying about NAFTA. When people see they might actually lose this, they're getting engaged. You know, they're starting to, and particularly the ag community, which is well organized, is sort of focusing on things. But you also have to help people adjust to change. And that's another place where, you know, I think that the U.S. has fallen short in terms of, you know, the U.S. spends about $18 to $19 billion a year. We have about 40, it used to be 48 different worker adjustment programs from 9 different agencies, but they were never evaluated, never checked. Look, I would be willing to go further to experiment with ideas. Like there's one that's called wage insurance. And so the idea would be, let's say you're making 50 grand a year and you lose your job. And you can get a job at 30,000. but you don't want to take $20,000 cut. So the idea of wage insurance would be you take some amount of that, say 50% of the difference for some period of time, and you make up the difference. Because the idea is, look, it's probably better to get people in the private sector workforce again. I think, frankly, given the nature of the government programs, a big deal is going to have to be made by the private sector. So you got AT&T down here. So I've listened to the CEO of AT&T, and he spends about 3 cents a share, he said, on training his workforce. And he's focused on saying, look, you got to tell people when their jobs are going to go away. You got to explain where jobs could be created, but you can't stop there. You then need to say what sort of certificate, what skills you need. Then you need to show people how they get certified. And I was speaking with the head of Coursera, who is actually now working with AT&T to help people make that transition. So at the end of the day, it's probably going to fall on the private sector to help people sort of make these adjustments. So there's no one piece of it. I agree with your point. The only thing I could say is, it's interesting. A lot of it does depend on, sorry to say, politicians having the guts to make the case on some of this. So look, here's an interesting fact most people don't know. Of America's imports, 60% are for intermediate goods. Okay? So that means you want to raise the cost of steel and aluminum? Fine. You're going to make a bunch of other people uncompetitive, okay? Because whether it's the capital goods, the raw materials, or others. So that's the danger that we have to be able to explain to different people. Or another way, it all depends on your audience. I've tried this in different places, In this part of the country, I'd remind people tariffs are taxes. So if you like taxes, go for tariffs.
Well, I think you brought out Ambassador Zoellick's political instincts there. The only thing I would add, Bob, I thought embraced a critical point in terms of helping people adjust to change. And I think the question was an excellent one about policy and politics, in this case, kind of colliding. I think the other point is that if you look at the governors, you'll see an overwhelming support for open and fair trade because they are driven by exports. So I think there's a big difference in how Washington elected officials look at trade and their individual constituencies versus governors who generally, both Republican and Democrats, are popular, have pretty good popularity, pretty good standing, take a very different view.
And foreign investment.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's...
So it's interesting. South Carolina used to be a very protectionist state. I mean, it goes back in the 1800s. It was a very free trade state because they wanted to sell their rice and cotton abroad. But in much of the late 20th century, because of the hit to the textile and the furniture industry, very protectionist. One of the senators now, Lindsey Graham, who's a friend of mine on foreign policy issues, used to kind of snarl at me on trade. He's become very open to trade because they now have, when BMW came in, they brought in a whole bunch of suppliers. And now I think they got more foreign direct investment per capita than any state in the union. And of course, then BMW starts to say, well, look, what do we need to do to educate the workforce? Can we work with the universities to bring in different types of technical vocational training? So it makes the point that Mac made, is that when you're on the ground, having somebody hire people is a good thing.
Makes a difference. Yes, sir. Next question.
Hello, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much for the talk and giving us the opportunity to shift the gear to perhaps the role that United States playing in other part of the world. So you did mention about the benefit of cooperation, regional cooperation on security, economic growth, and communities. Mm-hmm. I would appreciate if you a little bit elaborate on the role of U.S. in the stabilization of Middle East, by being the #1 provider of weapons to different dictatorships in the around Persian Gulf, constantly provide Saudi Arabia by different weapons that they massacre people of Yemen, and by its recent strategy toward the long-lasting struggle between Palestinians and Israeli people by just announcing the capital and U.S. president likely be there to open that. And just one last thing, while you were mentioning, you did mention a terrorist group based on your beliefs in Lebanon. So there are people that think otherwise. For example, EU doesn't recognize them as a terrorist group since they are having a very constructive role in the government of Lebanon. What they do is actually defending their country against invaders. That's what many people believe. And what you claimed on their roles in cooperation with the drug cartels in South America, you never actually released any evidence to back your claim. So thank you.
Thank you.
So the easiest thing to do, but I won't totally rely, is to rely on Ed Derigian, who's the Middle East expert here. So you need to sit down with Ed about it afterwards. I guess on Hezbollah, which you're sort of asking about, maybe when Hezbollah decides it could recognize Israel's right to exist, that would be a start. So right now, I mean, and this is where the world's going to go. You know, if you have Hezbollah with missile capacity, with increased guidance systems that can hit any location in Israel, you're going to have a conflict. I don't want to have a conflict. So I don't, you know, wouldn't that be nice if Hezbollah said we accept Israel's right to exist, or if Iran did the same? You know, what's so hard about that? Because if you're in Israel and you've had the experience that Jews have had, that's kind of a big question for you. Okay? And I don't blame them for it. Okay? Now, to come back to your other point about regional part, I have long felt that, frankly, the regimes in the Middle East, whether they became sort of state socialist regimes or sort of the old monarchies, were missing a chance to help their own people. And that goes back to issues that I talked about in trade or in development. And frankly, as you probably know, the Arab Human Rights Report or different development reports sort of made the main point. So what I've always believed is that, again, whether it moves to democracy or what space, that will be up to these countries and regions. But frankly, it has to start with some chance of economic opportunity and hope. So what I worked on in the trade, and certainly in the World Bank area, where I launched something called an Arab World Initiative, was to try, even at the time when you had the revolutions and at least what people hoped would be an Arab Spring, was to transform that into a situation where you could deal with some of the fundamental corruption of regimes, use some of these methods that I talked about for transparency so people could see the budget, use social media so people in Tunisia and various communities can comment on sort of where things were going. I still believe that's absolutely critical, okay? And and this is, you can debate about intervention in Libya, but one thing is for sure, you need to have some combination of security, governance, and development. So I was actually last week talking to a Moroccan where we'd worked on a free trade agreement. Morocco isn't perfect, but it's moved in a better direction, and there's more space, and there's sort of more economic opportunity. It's still a bit of an oligarchic system. Tunisia is absolutely fundamental, and I worry about the economic prospects in Tunisia as you have both the problems of dealing with local terrorists, other terrorists that are coming in. You know, the big ones that I'm most focused on is Egypt and Saudi Arabia. You mentioned Saudi Arabia. And because, as you probably know, there's about 90 million Egyptians, and Saudi Arabia is so critical. And frankly, you have both regimes talking about economic reforms. And if they're not successful, think how bad the tumultuous Middle East will turn, okay? And I had worked, when I was at the World Bank, in the late Mubarak years, they actually had a relatively good reform team, but they didn't have enough time. They were getting like 5, 6, 7% growth. They were trying to move subsidies to more efficient programs based on things that we saw in Mexico with the Oportunidades program and other things. I'm a little worried about the nature of the military regime and whether, frankly, it's not just the military regime, but it's the military's sort of hold on the economy. Now, in Saudi Arabia, I'll tell you frankly, I'm of mixed views, because on the one hand, I think the system has to change. And so I respect that MBS is, the Crown Prince has made some steps to try to realize the system has to change for women and education and trying to open up the economy. On the other hand, he's got a heck of a concentration of power in one place, and I believe there's some risks of mistakes, including, as you sort of referenced sort of Yemen in that process. I think the treatment of Qatar was sort of counterproductive, given everybody's perspective on Iran. So these all go to the points that, look, all I can tell you is whether it was Secretary Baker when I was with him or separately, these are not so easy problems, okay? And in the case of the Middle East, my own belief is unless you can create some basis for the economic reform and modernization process so people have some chance of hope that the other issues are not going to ultimately be successful, okay? And so maybe I'm a little bit more patient in terms of some of the political openness. I want to move in a direction, but those are sort of debatable points that people can have. As for U.S. policy on it, I mean, hey, I'm not exactly endorsing the Trump administration, so you can draw what conclusions you want. But I guess I'd say this. If the U.S. isn't engaged, okay, so if it's the Obama administration walking away from Syria, or if it's the way that the Trump administration has handled some of the issues, then I don't think the situation is going to get better. So I don't mean to say the U.S. can solve all these problems. We certainly can't solve them all by ourselves. But my basic argument is I'm more concerned about the U.S. detachment. So given your frustrations with U.S. policy, all I can say is, well, you may get your wish, and when the U.S. pulls back from the world, or decides that it doesn't have to spend money or have troops in all these places, then you can see what happens. And it's not a world that I want to see, but we'll watch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
But you got to see Dirigen. He's the guy that knows this stuff.
So we're going around the world here, and I think we've got time really for one last question. Let's double up over here real quickly, and then Bob, if we can kind of keep it tight
Sure.
here.
I'll be tighter.
At 8 o'clock. Yes, sir. And then go.
Would you comment on Trump's infatuation with the wall as to what effect it will have on our relationship with Mexico?
Thank you. Next question, real quick.
Excuse me. Could you explain to us who is appointed to be head of our negotiating team on NAFTA? Who appointed them? Who are they? And I understand that we're in like the 4th or 5th round of talks.
7th.
Okay, very close to the end. So how can we affect better policies? I have no idea what they're negotiating. Could you give us a short
I'll help you on both of those.
Going to conclude here on U.S. Mexico, which is great.
So on the wall, it's a very important question because it relates to trade and immigration. I wrote another piece for the Wall Street Journal late last year when people were trying to say, what's the coherence of Trump's foreign policy? And I said, you got to go back to who he considers to be his political base. And and I think he's going to hold faith with that political base. It's partly how he's going to define himself. And if you think about it, for whatever reason, people's resentments and frustrations, he was able to capture by talking about a wall with Mexico, immigration, trade protectionism. Those are the three things that he keeps hitting on, okay? Now, you do need border security. And there have been efforts to create different types of ways of security. I mean, most people who know the subject say, look, you need multiple layers, you need intelligence, a lot of the people we have as illegal immigrants come in on visas and stay. So a wall's not going to make one whit of difference to them. Or if you're worried about Central Americans, as we discussed, you actually alienating Mexico is going to sort of make it harder. So I think the wall is a symbol for him. And saying that Mexico is going to pay for the wall, which you've seen as great, is again sort of his symbol of it. I don't think he's going to move off it. And so, and I think it's going to be counterproductive. I'm not saying that you don't need border protection, but frankly, I think the billions that he's talking about for his type of wall is a waste of money. And I'm one of the last fiscal conservatives in America, I guess. Then on the NAFTA negotiation, look, I'll go out on a limb here. I'll give you about 40% chance that the U.S. withdraws from NAFTA. And I think the prospects of closing that negotiation obviously are pretty dim. And the reason why is that it's the reference that I made first with China about the bilateral trade deficit. Trump thinks bilateral trade deficits are like a business person thinks of negative net income. They're losing, okay? Now, most economists don't think that way, except Peter Navarro in the White House. And the example I try to say to people is, look, I have a negative trade deficit with my supermarket. But I don't try to create an offsetting account by stocking shelves at night. I make money somewhere else, okay? And that's how bilateral trade works. And Mexico, while it has a surplus with the United States, actually has a bigger deficit as a percentage of GDP globally than the US does. But because that drives Trump's view, he's trying to transform negotiations into an elimination of the deficit. And you really can't, the rules don't do that, right? So what happens is, if you look at all the provisions, they fall into three baskets. One is modernization of the agreement, which Mac and I were talking about. After 25 years, you want to capture some of the energy changes in Mexico, digital, e-commerce, whole series of things, put environment, labor in the agreement. By the way, almost all of them are language drawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Trump withdrew from, okay? But you know, hypocrisy in government isn't a new thing, right? So then the second section is a series of proposals that basically would allow the U.S. to escape of the rules. So I won't go into all of these, but you've heard about the 5-year sunset, or removal of the investor-state dispute settlement, or another special dispute settlement system with Canada. There's about 5 or 6 of them. And basically it's saying the U.S., it's a version of the question we got on the 232, national security, is saying when we want to cheat, we want to cheat. Okay, it's going to be a little hard for the other countries to accept that. Then the third is to try to deal with the bilateral trade deficit by dealing with rules of origin that say certain percentage of cars have to be made in the U.S. And that may sound okay, but it's kind of like saying to the Mexicans, okay, we'll sell you natural gas, and the Mexicans say, yeah, but 20% has to be from Mexico. Or we'll sell you corn, but 30% has to be from Mexico. You know, the nature of trade is you want to create a North American rule of origin because we don't have a common external barrier, but if you have a U.S. rule of origin, you're really saying we kind of want trade minus, okay? But the politics is just simply that I think it's going to be very hard for Mexico and Canada to agree to this. I may be wrong, but I don't think I will be. Mexico's obviously going into an election. That's going to make it harder. And so the Mexicans and Canadians aren't going to walk because they don't want to be blamed for killing the thing, right? But then the question is, what does Trump do? Okay, and there's one other part, you know, sort of things I used to learn from Secretary Baker, which was, okay, assume we do a deal, where are you going to get the votes? Remember NAFTA, Mac got NAFTA through the first time. It was a hard sell, okay? But let's just play a little politics here, okay? We got a new NAFTA agreement. And will the Democrats say, oh yeah, we'll support Trump on trade. That'll be good. Or might they say, look, he's taking a nationalist economic line. We'll trump him. We'll say, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't take care of that. You know, most of the Democratic members of Congress have moved more protectionist. I don't think you're going to get many Democratic votes. The Republican side, which was supporting this in 2015, that's kind of lost support. But can you imagine, you know, do a thought experiment. Can you imagine Trump saying, I really need you to vote for NAFTA too? That just doesn't ring authentic to me. So I don't think the votes are there if you did some sort of agreement, which I don't think you're going to reach anyway. Then the question is, will Trump withdraw? Which he has the authority to do, but there's a big debate about he can withdraw the tariffs, but some things are put in place by statute. There will be lawsuits. And that's where my closing message to all of you comes in. I think that depends on a couple of things. One is how much complaint he hears from the countryside, you know, from Aggies and others saying, oh, don't do this, you know, my God, you know, it's okay to try to fix it, but don't kill the damn thing. Or it's also going to be depending what happens with these other protectionist actions. Because what you see individually is they're small to the relative the size of the U.S. economy, but they start to add up, and you start to get retaliations, and you start to get escalation, and people worry about losing control. Again, I work in financial markets. You see financial markets getting a little edgy, and so Wall Street Journal editorial page says, hey, we like the tax bill, we like growth, but for God's sakes, don't kill it with this stuff. So what message will they get back? And then you get into the world that is beyond my comprehension, which is, how does Trump think about this, okay? And I say that actually in humility, not a joke, because I've been wrong. Although the one thing I haven't been wrong on is on the trade. I knew he would do what he's doing, and it's going to be a bumpy road.
Well, Ambassador Zoellick, Bob, you confirmed everything that Secretary Baker and I said about you, as we knew we would. Thank all of you for joining us. Ambassador Ridgeland, thank you for hosting us at this truly crown jewel of Rice University, the Baker Institute. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you. Good night. Great job, Bob.